Welcome to the May 18th public hearing for the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Area Board. Mr. Scully with the city will take over from here for some explanations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the members of the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Area Board for your participation today, as well as all of our attendees in the audience, virtually. For those of you in attendance for today's CBPA virtual public hearing, my name is PJ Scully, and I am staff liaison to the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Area Board. Due to the current situation surrounding the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic, today's public meeting is being conducted electronically in accordance with Virginia Code 2.2-3708.2, Section A, subsection 3, and Virginia Code 15.2-1413, and the city's Continuity of Government Ordinance adopted on March 31st, 2020, and Chapter 854 of the 2019 Acts of the Assembly as amended, with the chair of the Virginia Beach Chesapeake Bay Preservation Area Board having called this special meeting today for this public hearing. Also, please note, this meeting is being recorded. Mr. Chairman, there are 4 items on today's agenda. One agenda item is requesting a deferral. That is agenda item number 3. One agenda item is recommended by staff to be an item of consent. That is agenda item number 2. 2 agenda items will be heard in full. Those are agenda item number 1 and number 4. At the end of staff's presentation for each agenda item, the CBPA board chair will open the floor for questions. It is important that board members hold their questions and comments until recognized. Also, it is helpful for board members, upon completion of a comment or a question, to state that you are done making your point or that you will stand by for a response to your question. This helps to ensure that it is understood that you are done speaking and that your questions have been answered before staff moves on to the next board member or on to the next agenda item. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, for today's public hearing, staff has received 5 speakers registered for the hearing. Agenda item number 1, we have 2 speakers, and we have 2 emails for opposition to the request. Agenda item number 2, we have 1 speaker. Agenda item number 3, 1 speaker. And agenda item number 4, 1 speaker. For those intending to speak to an agenda item, staff will attempt to facilitate real-time citizen participation and comments in the public hearing for these citizens who are registered. To ensure this live electronic public hearing is successful, please note the following meeting instructions must be followed. CBPA chairman will open the public hearing once staff is done speaking. Order of business will be described by the chair, and agenda items will be presented and addressed by the order of business. The order of business will be agenda items being withdrawn, followed by agenda items requesting a deferral. Next, agenda items recommended for consent by the board, and last, we will hear regular agenda items for today. Staff will present each agenda item and then call the applicants or the applicant's agent to the platform. Those who have registered in advance with staff to speak on an agenda item will be called to speak in the order which they registered. Speakers will have up to 3 minutes to make their comments. If the speaker does not respond or if a technical issue occurs which renders the comments unintelligible, I will move on to the next registered speaker and we will attempt to correct the connection. Board members and audiences, please mute any additional devices you may have in the room to avoid any unnecessary background noise and or the possibility of echoing and reverberation through the mic. It is important that once your name is called, please wait 2 to 3 seconds to ensure that you are unmuted so that the board, staff, and the public hear your complete remarks. Please begin your comments by identifying yourself. Also, do not ask if you can hear me, as the only feed open is you at the time to minimize the echo or reverberation, and as such, you will be unable to hear a response. All votes for today's public hearing and the roll call will be taken verbally. Staff is going to conduct the votes in alphabetical order by the last name of our board members. At the conclusion of the public hearing, the CBPA board chair will move to close the public hearing. The chair will ask for a motion and a second amongst the CBPA board members. Mr. Chairman, members of the CBPA board, are there any questions about this process?
If you would remind them to raise their virtual hand.
If you have a question at this time, please raise your virtual hand.
Casey Jones.
Mr. Jones, staff acknowledges your virtual hand and opens the mic to you.
Thank you, PJ. And Mr. Chairman, are we going to be able to send any chats regarding questions we want to ask, or if we want to develop a consent agenda with the chairman? Is he online as well? I don't see him in the participant list.
Mr. Jones, Mr. Jester is in the council chambers with us, and you will have the opportunity when he opens up the consent agenda to have that discussion.
He has his hand back.
Mr. Jones, at this time, we will recognize your virtual hand and bring you to the microphone.
Okay. Oh, I don't mean to still have it raised. I'm sorry.
That is not a problem. Thank you for your question. Now staff will acknowledge Chairman for his question. Mr. Jester?
PJ, just one point of clarification. After staff makes the presentation, I will ask the board if they have questions of staff. And once that's completed, then the applicant's agent or the applicant will present, correct?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that is correct. At this time, are there any other questions of the board members to staff? At this time, seeing no further questions, staff would like to say thank you to all who are in attendance today. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your patience. Let's enjoy this virtual public hearing. And I will now turn the meeting over to Chairman Jester to open the public hearing.
Welcome to the May 18th, 2020 virtual public hearing for the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Area Board. As previously mentioned, please mute any additional devices you have in the room to avoid any unnecessary background noise and/or the possibility of echoing or reverberation. It is important that once your name is called, please wait 2 to 3 seconds to ensure that we all hear your complete remarks. Please begin your comments by identifying yourself. Also, do not ask, "Can you hear me?" as only one feed is open at a time to minimize the echo or reverberation, and as such, you will be unable to hear a response. If you plan on giving testimony before the board today, you will be sworn in individually at the beginning of the agenda item you plan to give testimony on. The order of business today will be as follows: withdrawal or deferral agenda items. First is a consideration of requests to be withdrawn and deferred. If the item you registered to speak on is requested to be deferred, you will be called upon to make your opposition known. However, please speak only to the matter of the deferral and not to the merits of the item. Next will be the consent agenda items. These are items that the board looks favorably upon and are without opposition. If you wish to speak to an item on the consent agenda, you will be called upon when the item is called. If there is no opposition to an item on the consent agenda, it will be moved, if there is opposition to an item on the consent agenda, it will be moved to the regular agenda to be heard in its normal order. Consent items will be voted upon as a block and will not be brought up again for further consideration. Next will be regular agenda items. These items will proceed in the following manner: summary by the application by staff, statements by the applicant or agent and proponents, statements by any opponents, rebuttal by the applicant or agent, and deliberation and disposition of the application by the board. During board deliberation, there will be no further public comment unless a question is asked by the board. The board will remind all participants that the application is limited to 10 minutes and all other speakers are limited to 3 minutes each. Staff will be timing presentations and will mute the speaker at the end of 3 minutes. There will be an opportunity for the board to ask questions of both the applicant and of the speakers if desired. Last is show cause and restoration agenda items. We have none of those. Please note that any actions by the board today may be appealed to the Virginia Beach Circuit Court within 30 days. The board may take a break at the time and length at their discretion. I don't anticipate that today. Finally, all fees payable to the City of Virginia Beach for an application must be paid for an application to be considered complete. So, approval of the minutes. The first item before us today is the approval of the minutes from the February board meeting. Please raise your virtual hand if there are any additions or corrections to the minutes. We have a motion.
Mr. Chairman, at this time, we do not see any virtual hands being raised. Proceed with your motion.
Any board member that would like to make a motion to approve these minutes, please raise your hand.
Try Mr. McCoy.
Mr. McCoy, the microphone is open to you.
Yeah, I just want to make a motion to approve the minutes.
I don't see a second yet. All right. Mr. Jones?
Mr. Jones, the microphone is open to you.
I will second that motion.
He's muted.
Mr. Chairman, Board Member Jones has requested to make the second. Now, we have the floor.
So everybody in favor of approving the minutes?
Call.
The vote is open, and staff will call each board member individually. If you are in favor of the motion, say yes. If you are opposed, say no. Please pause for 3 seconds after I call your name To ensure that you are unmuted, staff is going to go through the board members alphabetically. First, Ms. Barrett McDaniels.
Aye.
Second, Mr. France.
Yes.
Third, Mr. Jester. Fourth, Mr. Jones.
Yes.
Fifth, Mr. McCoy.
Yes.
Sixth, Mr. Smith.
Yes.
Seventh, Mr. Steyer.
Yes.
And last, Mr. Wallace.
Yes.
This vote will also serve as roll call for those present today. We do have a quorum with Mr. Dreps being absent. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, you have one agenda item requesting a deferral today. This is agenda item number 3. Are there any board members abstaining to this agenda item at this time? If so, please raise your virtual hand for staff to address.
Staff.
Seeing no board members abstaining from this agenda item, staff calls the applicant's agent to speak. We will be bringing Mr. Garrington to the podium in one moment, but staff would like to remind you that your time is limited to 10 minutes. Also, please identify yourself and pause for 3 seconds before you begin speaking. Thank you, and Mr. Garrington, the microphone is now yours.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, thank you very much. On behalf of the applicant, we would like to request a 60-day deferral on agenda item number 3 on Leeward Shore Drive. We need to do some reworking of the footprint of that house, and we need that time to bring a better plan back to you that will meet with the approval of the neighbors and staff. So we're requesting a 60-day deferral.
Are there any questions of the applicant by the board? Please raise your virtual hand. Having seen no virtual hands raised by the board members, staff will now read in any statements of opposition. At this time, giving the deferral of the item, staff has not received any statements of opposition. Any calls to any attendees in attendance for today's public hearing? Again, staff has not received any attendee notification regarding the deferral of this item. At this time, Mr. Chairman, staff opens the mic to any board members with comments to this agenda item. At this time, please raise your virtual hand and staff will address.
Mr. Jones.
Mr. Jones, staff acknowledges your virtual hand and the microphone is yours.
I'd like to make a motion to defer. I'm done with my comments.
Mr. Chairman, staff now opens the mic to you to call for a second.
Do we have a second on the motion to defer?
Mr. Steyer.
Staff acknowledges the virtual hand of Mr. Steyer as a potential second. Board Member Steyer, the mic is now open to you.
I second.
Ms. Barrett has her hand up also.
Staff acknowledges the virtual hand of Ms. Barrett. Ms. Barrett, the mic is now open to you.
I just plan a second.
She wanted a second.
Thank you, Ms. Barrett. Hearing a second to defer the application. Hearing a second to defer the application of Charles E. and Mary G. White, property off of Leeward Shore Drive, GPIN number 2409198659, has been made by, is that first one, Mr. Smith?
It was, yes, and then.
Having
Steyer.
been made by Mr. Smith and seconded by Mr. Steyer, the vote is open and staff will call each board member individually. If you are in favor of this motion, please state yes. If you are opposed, please state no, noting that you should pause for 3 seconds after your name is called so that you can be unmuted. Staff opens the microphone to Ms. Barrett McDaniels.
Yes.
Second, Mr. France.
Yes.
Third, Mr. Jester. Fourth, Mr. Jones.
Yes.
Fifth, Mr. McCoy.
Yes.
Sixth, Mr. Smith.
Yes.
Seventh, Mr. Steyer. Mr. Steyer, staff will reopen your mic.
Yes.
Lastly, Mr. Wallace.
Yes.
By a vote of 8-4, 0 against, the motion has carried. The item will be deferred. At this time, staff would like to provide a bit of insight for our board members. and remind them that your virtual hand for this public hearing is located at the lower right-hand corner of the screen. Next, consent agenda items. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, after reviewing staff's report and the associated CBPA exhibits provided by the applicants, and after hearing staff's earlier recommendation for agenda item number 2, property located at 936 East Sparrow Road, do you wish to hear any items of the regular agenda as an item of consent? At this time, please raise your virtual hand for staff to address.
The question I have is Mr. Reese is having difficulty finding his virtual hand. Mr. Jones.
At this time, staff will address Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, you have the mic.
Thank you, PJ. I've been chatting with some of the other board members, and I do not see any objection to item number 2 coming from the other board members that I have had a response in the chat. There's only one question on item number 4, and due to the fact that we haven't had an informal to answer one question, may we have the opportunity to ask one point of clarification that Mr. Wallace brought up to see if we need to put this on the full agenda versus the consent, unless there's any other questions. And the only question was distance of the improvements from the top of bank being 75 feet from a prior variance. Can you answer that one question and see if any other board members might want to add that one to consent if your question answers their concerns? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. At this time, staff would like to point out one item of clarification. With the board members, please do not use the sidebar as a chat. All discussion for agenda items must be done through the public hearing and be addressed to all board members. Mr. Jones, going back to your question regarding agenda item number 4, the distance from the top of bank is approximately 60 feet. Any other virtual hands go up? There is one more.
Mr. Jones's hand is up again, and Ms. Barrett's hand is up, but I don't believe she put it down.
At this time, staff will address the virtual hand of Ms. Barrett McDaniels.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize that my hand was up. I'm glad that you clarified about the chat, because I wasn't aware that we were chatting.
Mr. Jones' hand?
Thank you, June. At this time, staff will address the virtual hand of Mr. Jones.
I apologize for using the chatting, as I did not realize we were not supposed to do that. I will do everything else on the virtual meeting from this point on. In light of the fact that agenda item number 4 is 60 feet, not 75, we'll move that to the regular agenda. So I will make a motion to add agenda item number 2, applicant Karen M. Jefferson at 936 East Sparrow Road to the consent agenda as previously mentioned, pending any opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Staff will now recognize the chair for comments. Mr. Jester?
My comment is, this is an excellent application. Staff has recommended consent. It is a modest increase in impervious, and we get benefits that we don't previously have. We've discussed many times in the past about top of bank not being, that's an engineering question. It's not having to do with water quality control. I don't think that's an item that should be discussed because we've discussed that way in the past. This should be on the consent agenda, and I'd like to hear a vote for approval of consent agenda and a second, and see if we have enough votes to carry it as a consent.
At this time, staff would like to acknowledge the virtual hand of Mr. France. Mr. France, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, PJ. It's Mr. France. I was going to second Casey's motion, Mr. Jones's motion for approval of the consent agenda.
Mr. Jones's hands up.
At this time, staff will acknowledge the virtual hand of Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, the microphone is yours.
In light of the chairman's comments, is there any opposition to adding consent to the consent agenda item number 4 regarding the only question being the top of bank? We can add agenda item number 4 to the consent agenda.
Having heard Mr. Jones' comments to bring agenda item number 4 to the consent agenda, if there's any questions or comments regarding this motion, board members, would you please raise your virtual hand at this time for staff to address?
She ever put her hand down. It's been a long time.
I saw one.
Mr. France.
Mr. France. At this time, staff acknowledges the virtual hand of Mr. France.
Did Mr. Jones make a adjustment to his motion officially, and we're now voting on a substitute motion?
Yes, that is correct. Mr. Jones made a motion to have agenda item number 2 and agenda item number 4 on the consent agenda.
Mr. France.
At this time, Mr. France, staff recognizes your virtual hand and opens the mic to you.
This is Mr. France. I'll second the substitute motion to include both items 2 and 4 in consent.
I think we can go right into it. Hearing a second to approve the following applications on the consent agenda. Agenda item number 2. Property located at 936 East Sparrow Road for the applicant of Karen M. Jefferson. And agenda item number 4. Property located at 2916 Gaines Landing Road. Property owner Christopher and Yasmin Hooper, and the applicant being Dr. Yugal Beal. The vote will be open and staff will call upon each board member individually. If you are in favor of the motion, say yes. And if you are opposed, say no. A reminder to pause 3 seconds after your name is called so that you can be unmuted. At this time, staff acknowledges the chairman for a comment. Mr. Chairman?
Thank you, PJ. I just have one point. Should we not ask the agents, the applicant or the agents, that if they're fine with all the conditions the staff has imposed before we vote on the consent agenda? If they're okay and do not want to remove for discussion, then we could proceed with the vote. We could just ask them if they're okay with all those conditions, both cases, the applicant or the agent. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, you are correct. Staff will call the applicant or the applicant's agent to speak and ask that the applicant or their agent, if they agree to the recommended conditions of the CBPA variance request provided by staff. To the applicant or the applicant's agent, please identify yourself for the record, indicate whether your fees have been paid, and that your disclosure statements are current. You will have 10 minutes to speak, and please pause for 3 seconds after being called upon in order for staff to unmute you. Again, thank you for your application, and at this time, staff will call to the microphone Mrs. Karen Jefferson. Mrs. Jefferson, the microphone is yours.
Yes, hi, thank you. I have read the board's recommendations and will agree and follow them. That is all I have to say. I'm done with my statements.
Thank you, Mrs. Jefferson. At this time, staff will call to the podium Mr. Garrington. Mr. Garrington, the microphone is yours.
PJ, members of the board, thank you very much. On behalf of application number 4, on Gaines Landing, our disclosure statement is current. All of our fees have been paid. We're in total agreement with the 17 conditions that staff has put on this application, and we thank you for putting this on the consent agenda. I'm done.
Thank you, Mr. Garrington. Staff restates, after hearing a motion to approve the following applications on the consent agenda. Agenda item number 2, 936 East Sparrow Road, for the property owner and applicant of Karen M. Jefferson. And agenda item number 4, 2916 Gaines Landing, for the property owner of Christopher and Yasmin Hooper and the applicant Dr. Ugal Beal. Has been made by Mr. Jones and seconded by Mr. France. The vote is open and staff will call each board member individually. At this time, Ms. Barrett McDaniels, the microphone is yours.
I vote no on this. I'm sorry that I didn't have an opportunity to comment about adding item 4 because I would rather hear that because it doesn't meet the original conditions of the subdivision.
Mr. France, the microphone is yours.
So I'll vote yes for the motion, but a point of protocol here, if any board member is in opposition to the consent agenda, then that item gets pulled from the consent agenda, does it not?
Mr. France, staff acknowledges your question, and yes, you are correct. Mr. France, the microphone is back to you.
I vote yes on the motion.
Mr. Jester, the microphone is to you. Mr. Jones, the microphone is to you.
I vote yes, but is this the appropriate time to now just make a substitute motion? Or do we need to go through the full motion since it's already failed? I'm done.
Mr. Jones, to answer your question, we will make a new motion regarding agenda item number 2 on the consent agenda and move item number 4 to the regular agenda. So at this time, staff acknowledges the modification to the consent agenda and asks for a motion. Please raise your virtual hand. Mr. McCoy, staff acknowledges your virtual hand and the microphone is yours.
Yeah, just as a point of clarification, wouldn't it be cleaner just to withdraw that motion? And or you're asking for a substitute motion?
If it didn't pass, because if a consent motion can't pass, if it's not truly consent, then it's dead, so just make a new motion.
At this time, we will just make a new motion.
Call Mr. McCoy.
Mr. McCoy, staff acknowledges your virtual hand. The microphone is yours.
Okay, I'll make a motion that item number 2 is placed on the consent agenda.
At this time, staff acknowledges the virtual hand of Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, the microphone is yours.
I second the motion.
Hearing a second, the motion to approve the following application on the consent agenda. Agenda item number 2, 936 East Sparrow Road, for the property owner and applicant of Karen M. Jefferson, has been made by Mr. McCoy and a second by Mr. Jones. The vote is open and staff will call on each board member individually. Ms. Barrett McDaniels, the microphone is yours.
Yes.
Mr. France, the microphone is yours.
Yes.
Mr. Jester, the microphone is yours.
Yes.
Mr. Jones, the microphone is yours.
Yes.
Mr. McCoy, the microphone is yours.
Yes?
Mr. Smith, the microphone is yours.
Yes.
Mr. Steyer, the microphone is yours.
Yes.
And Mr. Wallace, the microphone is yours.
Yes, and PJ, I don't see a virtual hand, although I saw it last week when we discussed. I don't see it this morning. So I'm unable to make any comments.
Yes, sir. Thank you. By a vote of 8-0, the motion has carried. and the application at 936 East Sparrow Road for the property owner and applicant of Karen M. Jefferson has been approved. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, next is the regular agenda. The presentation of the regular agenda items will be as follows. A summary of the application will be provided by staff. Statements by the applicant, their agent, and proponents will follow. And then statements by any opponents after that. Next will be the rebuttal by the applicant and the agent, and then the deliberation of the application will be heard. Before we get into the regular agenda items, staff will like to point out once again, if you would like to raise your virtual hand on the lower right-hand corner of the WebEx presentation, you will see an icon of either a hand or a microphone. If you click on that icon in the lower right-hand corner, you will be able to raise your virtual hand. Mr. Wallace, at this time, staff opens the microphone to you for any additional questions.
Yes, I still don't see the virtual hand in the lower right-hand corner, and I've checked the other corners, and I still don't see the virtual hand. I don't know if I need to sign out and come back in or what.
At this time, we would ask that you do not sign out and come back in. And please bear with staff for one moment. Thank you.
So if they have floated their screen, it may be below the chat. Or he can text me, but I'm trying to get him on the phone.
At this time, Mr. Wallace, staff will direct another statement to you and any board members that may have difficulty finding their virtual hand. It may be below the chat on the right-hand side. At this time, staff opens the microphone to Mr. Wallace.
Yes, PJ. Question is, how do I open up the chat? Where's the icon for the chat?
Turn it back on, but they would need to keep their chat just to the host.
Mr. Wallace, at this time, in the middle of your screen, you will see a circle. It looks like a silhouette of an individual with 3 lines. Would you please click on that?
Yes, I have done that.
And that should open up your windows to the right, and at the bottom you should see an icon that you may click on for your virtual hand.
Roger that. I have it now. Thank you.
Sir, thank you, members of the board. Next, we will be moving into staff's presentation of agenda item number 1. At this time, staff asks for the presentation to be presented. Thank you. Agenda item number 1, Olympia Development, is the applicant Current property owner is the city of Virginia Beach. This is a property that was deferred, or this is an application that was deferred at the February 2020 CBPA Board public hearing and is now back in front of us today. The CBPA variance request is for encroachment into the resource protection area buffer for the development of 3 office buildings and associated infrastructure. This is a site aerial of the property off of Bonnie Road. To the bottom of the screen, you will see Independence Boulevard. To the right is I-264. Currently, in the middle of the property, or towards the edge of the property, the dashed line represents, excuse me, I gotta put my glasses on so I can see. Dashed line represents the approximate location of the Thalia Creek Greenway. This is the Thalia Creek Greenway Phase 2, which has been constructed. All of the proposed improvements associated with this variance request is to the left-hand side of the Thalia Creek Greenway as shown on the screen. To the right-hand side, approximately 61,852 square feet, or about 14% of the lot area outside of water, marsh, and wetlands, will not be disturbed with the proposed improvements. Looking at the conceptual layout for the office complex and associated infrastructure, as staff mentioned, the yellow dashed line represents the approximate location of the Thalia Creek Greenway. When laid over the proposed improvements are landward of the Thalia Creek Greenway, as shown on the screen. You will see a secondary access off of Bonnie Road, as well as a primary access towards the lower portion of the screen. You will see an office building located here where staff has their cursor, associated parking, access road coming into the property, second office building to the left right here with associated parking deck, and then access along the rear of the property, again landward of the Thalia Creek Greenway, entering into the last area of parking in the third office building before you exit out through the secondary entrance onto Bonnie Road. Looking at pictures of the site, this is along Bonnie Road with your back to Bonnie Road looking into the property. This is the location of the 2 office buildings. As you start to pan around back to Bonnie Road, next you will see a photo taken from the Thalia Creek Greenway with Bonnie Road in the background where you see those vehicles. This is looking along the Greenway. In this photo right here, everything you see to the left-hand side will remain in a natural state. To your right-hand side are the proposed improvements associated with the variance request. This is the newly completed Phase 2 of the Thalia Creek Greenway. On the right-hand side of the photo, you will see the bridge over Thalia Creek of Constitution Drive. Panning around and then heading towards the property where the proposed improvements are situated. This is the culvert off of Bonnie Road and represents the terminus of our RPA feature. That is the open ditch that is on the adjacent property, and staff will walk you down through the existing ditch. Where you see those 2 culverts is the approximate location of where the secondary access will connect to Bonnie Road with the redevelopment of that crossing. And then walking down through the channel to the property located below. And then a look back upstream at the existing ditch. What you see on the screen right now is an aerial from approximately 1990, where this property did have previous development. Areas in white indicate areas of impervious cover or compacted surfaces. An overlay of the proposed improvements will show the green line of the Thalia Creek Greenway, and then all of the proposed improvements landward of that Thalia Creek Greenway. Up on the screen now is the revised variance exhibit. Since the February 2020 CBPA Board public hearing, revisions have been made to the proposed improvements. If you are following along in the staff report, those revisions are noted towards the bottom of page 9. Those revisions include approximately 6,321 square foot reduction in the amount of encroachment within the 100-foot resource protection area. Second, 3 areas of underground stormwater facilities have been delineated. You have Area 1, Area 2, and Area 3. Collectively, each area is approximately 7,000 cubic feet of stormwater storage for a total of 21,000 cubic feet. Last, limits of disturbance shown for the construction of the access way off of Bonnie Road, located at the eastern portion of the property, have been provided. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, before staff calls the applicant and their agent, are there any questions for staff? At this time, please raise your virtual hand to be called on.
Mr. Wallace.
Mr. Wallace, staff acknowledges your virtual hand. The microphone is yours.
Yes, PJ, the total amount of 21K capacity, how close is this to the city's calculation of what the capacity should be?
Mr. Wallace, at this time, staff would defer that question to the applicant's agent. Staff and other members of the City of Virginia Beach, specifically our stormwater engineer within the Development Services Center and Public Works, have been working with the applicant and their agent regarding stormwater modeling for this area. What you have in front of you today is the request to encroach into the resource protection area with the proposed improvements. And with the reduction of encroachment into the resource protection area and the needed classification of the underlying soils, those numbers regarding stormwater management may differ.
Mr. Wallace raises his hand.
Mr. Wallace, at this time, staff will acknowledge your virtual hand and the microphone is yours.
Yes, in the photo that you showed on the secondary access, that appears to be an access that's about 10 feet wide. This is probably more a construction rather than stormwater mitigation effort. But are they going to construct and impede more onto the RPA? As a result of, because that's too narrow of an access? I'm done.
To answer Mr. Wallace's question, Mr. Wallace, at this time, that accessway, that secondary accessway, located along the eastern portion of the property, is wider than 10 feet. It is actually shown at our Public Works specification and standard width. There will be one drive aisle for ingress and two drive aisles for egress, one where you can make a either a right or left-hand turn onto Bonnie Road. Staff recognizes the virtual hand of Mr. France. Mr. France, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Scully. In previous presentations on this proposal, we had questions, or I had a question about the area of parking that is associated with the east side of the building where that's crossing over top of the RPA feature happens. And my concern when you look at aerials is that that's a pretty robust stand of trees and one of the few intact pieces of greenway connection that is in the area. Had staff taken any further look at that or discussed that with the applicant to try to see if there's any way of further mitigating that stand of trees being removed with this application?
Thank you, Mr. France. What you have in front of you today, if I can have my presentation projected up onto the screen, you will see that we have worked with the applicant's agent since the last public hearing. There's been a defined limits of construction set along the western side of the proposed accessway, also with the routing of underground utilities from the proposed stormwater management facilities. Those areas have been, or that means of infrastructure is within the land disturbance that would be associated with the roadway. In addition, as you come back that spine, specifically along the areas of the Thalia Creek Greenway, that is a portion where the existing impervious cover, or the proposed impervious cover, has been reduced. In mitigating for the encroachment of those trees or that vegetated area, we have set limits of constructions in that area associated with condition 5 of the staff report on page 11, as well as the mitigation or restoration of that area associated with condition 3 in the staff report on page 11, specifically the approximately 29,403 square feet in that area to be restored to a riparian buffer ecosystem. At this time, are there any additional questions for staff? Mr. Wallace, staff acknowledges your virtual hand. The microphone is yours.
To turn it off, I guess you have to hit it again. But coattailing the previous remark, I understand what you're saying in restoring the riparian area there. But taking a look at that entire area, it's a good marshland for stormwater mitigation. I just feel concerned that we're not protecting that huge area. And was just going to ask you, have they found a means of, because it's a huge area, to find a suitable means of matching the effectiveness of that marshland, employing another strategy. I'm done.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace. The strategy that was discussed in several meetings with the applicant's agent, and staff, one was obviously the retention of the 61,000 plus square feet of riparian buffer, which is seaward of the existing Thalia Creek Greenway. Second was looking at the mitigation and restoration of the land between the existing Thalia Creek Greenway and the proposed improvements. And if staff could get their presentation placed up on the screen, you will see that in this green hatched area along this area of the Thalia Creek Greenway. So restoring that in a means of a buffer restoration that complements this area on the seaward side of the existing riparian buffer. As mentioned before, one area of retreat, of significant retreat, was this area right here, where that should allow some additional preservation of that green spine that you all see and are referring to, and then carrying up through here with limits of construction, specifically this area right here, that will preserve the existing riparian buffer off of that secondary access to Bonnie Road. And at this time, staff will open to any comments from board members. Mr. Jester, staff acknowledges your hand. The microphone is yours.
So PJ, in early March, the owner of the property, which happens to be the City of Virginia Beach, invited me to attend a workshop between the applicant's engineers and city staff. I'm not an engineer, but I invited Dave France because he is. We both attended, and there were 4 specific items that we asked them to address. And it was a great debate and discussion back and forth between staff and the applicant's engineers. And those 4 specific items that had been brought up as areas of concern for the previous 2 deferrals, I felt were thoroughly discussed and addressed by the end of the meeting. I want you just to acknowledge that you pretty much agree with that scenario.
Yes, sir, you are correct.
So, as I said, there were things that we wanted to see, the treatment of water on site, not additional encroachment or actual retreatment from the RPA, how they were going to handle the secondary access, and any potential and reduction for impervious through parking. And they worked very hard on this. I was impressed with the amount of work they did and came back to city staff. So I just want everybody to know that they have done work since the previous deferral. And I think actually now we have a very good application. That's all.
At this time, staff recognizes the virtual hand of Mr. Wallace. Mr. Wallace, the microphone is yours.
So how do you turn the virtual hand off?
Click that virtual hand a second time.
Okay, but I see the square box continues, doesn't go away.
It's off right now.
That is correct, but your virtual hand is down. At this time, are there any additional questions for staff from the board members? Please raise your virtual hand.
Mr. Jones?
Mr. Jones, staff acknowledges your virtual hand. The microphone is yours.
Pending hearing the letters of opposition, I think this is a very good plan. I want to thank Mr. Jester and Mr. France for going to that meeting and working with these applicants and the city to resolve some of the questions we had from the plan in February. I'm in, from a standpoint of what they're doing to mitigate, the off-site water pollution and treatment of the water. I think they've addressed all of our questions of what the concerns are to this board that I can see pending the reading of the letters, and I'm in favor of this project at this standpoint. I'm done.
Mr. France?
Thank you, Mr. Jones. At this time, staff will acknowledge the virtual hand of Mr. France. Mr. France, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, and would like to echo our chair's remarks. We did have that meeting, did attend, and it did appear that they did a very good job of trying to mitigate the questions that we sent them away to answer when we deferred this last time. So it does appear that they've shown us the stormwater and how that's going to fit on the site. They pulled some of their parking out of the buffer that previous iterations had them in the 100-foot, so we were able to retreat. And they've looked at the amount of mitigation that might be required with the required road crossing, which is really the biggest reason why this is still in front of us. So I don't have any other questions. I did want to just make sure that the rest of the board members knew that I agreed with Mr. Jester on that. And at this time, I would like to recognize Ms. McDaniels, whose hand also looks like it's up.
It's been a little time.
Thank you, Mr. France. At this time, staff will recognize the virtual hand of Ms. Barrett McDaniels. June, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. I have a question about where we are right now. Are we going to hear from the applicant and then have an opportunity to ask them questions?
Yes, once staff's presentation is complete and there are no other questions from members of the board, I will read into record the 2 letters of opposition and then open up the discussion to the applicant's agents. At this time, staff returns the mic to Ms. Barrett McDaniels. June, the mic is yours.
Thank you.
Questions for staff? Please raise your virtual hand. Having none, staff will read into the record the 2 letters of opposition received regarding the variance request. Mr. P.J. Scully, no, no, no. No to the encroachment into the resource protection area. It will impact only in a negative way for those of us who live here. But more importantly is the impact on the environment. For once, please have the city use some common sense and do the right thing. Janice Robinson, 405 Genoa Circle. Second letter of opposition. Dear Mr. Scully, as a property owner in the Columbus Station Townhome Complex, I would like to register my objection to the proposed development of the above-referenced Bonnie Road office building complex. I was quite pleased and encouraged when the City of Virginia Beach had the foresight to create the Thalia Creek Greenway project. With the existing, ongoing, and pre-approved construction projects in and around Columbus and Bonnie Road, I look at the Thalia Greenway project as a small but valuable island in an ocean of concrete. The thought that this modest plot of nature may be reduced by even more urban sprawl is upsetting. I know it is somewhat of a stretch comparison, but imagine how tragic it would be if the New York City planners allowed Central Park to be nibbled away by developers. The Thalia Greenway will become our Central Park, and it must be protected at all costs. This is truly a unique property. Once it is gone, it can never be replaced or restored. I believe that the property in question, adjacent to the protected green area, is quite desirable from a developer's viewpoint. I'm quite confident that if the CBPA rightly turns down Olympia Development's request, another developer will follow with a plan that will develop the property within the current commercial zoning limits and not press for the destruction of beautiful, natural, and existing preserve. Please do the right thing for our city and our planet and deny Olympia's encroachment requests. Sincerely, Paul Giersey. Mr. Chairman, those were the two letters of opposition that staff received regarding this application. Staff did acknowledge the receipt of both emailed oppositions. And at this time, if there are no other questions for staff, staff will now call upon the applicant and the applicant's agents. The applicant and the applicant's agents are reminded to please identify themselves for the record, indicate that their fees have been paid and that their disclosure statements are current. Staff will acknowledge and open the microphone so that they may be sworn in. You will have 10 minutes to speak, and please pause for 3 seconds after called upon in order to unmute you. Thank you, and at this time, staff will acknowledge the floor to Mr. Billy Garrington. Mr. Garrington, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, PJ. Thank you, Mr. Jester. Members of the Chesapeake Bay Board, for the record, Billy Garrington on behalf of the applicant, Olympia Development, property on Bonnie Road. Let me tell you that our disclosure statement is still current. All of our fees have been paid. We thank you for again deliberating this request that has been in front of.
Can I unmute? Mr. Garrington, this is staff. I would just like to let you know we have you muted at this time. We are just checking to see that your audio was on. At this time, I am going to open the microphone up to the chairman. The chairman will swear you in. At that time, we will unmute your microphone and you may go into your presentation. At this time, Mr. Chairman, the microphone is yours.
Mr. Garrington, do you swear or affirm that the testimony you give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Mr. And the microphone is now yours.
So help me God.
At this time, Mr. Garrington, you may proceed with your presentation for agenda item number 1.
Thank you, PJ. Thank you, Mr. Jester and members of the Bay Board. For the record, Billy Garrington on behalf of the applicant, Olympia Development. Property on Bonnie Road. Our disclosure statement is current. All of our fees have been paid. We thank you very much for deliberating this case again for about the 4th time. As you remember, we were back in front of you in February personally, and we were given some items that the board members wanted us to do a revision on, and we have gone back and done those to the best that we can. There are 2 other people, PJ, who also want to speak on this today, so I want to be as brief as possible. Brad Martin wants to have time to answer any questions that you may have. He's the consulting engineer. And also Taylor Adams, who is with Economic Development, City of Virginia Beach, who owns the property. But again, this is a project that has great potential for economic development and tax revenue to the City of Virginia Beach. This just isn't somebody putting an accessory structure in their backyard. This project will bring in tax revenue, jobs, the likes of which we don't very often see in front of the Chesapeake Bay Board because we're normally dealing with residential properties. So with that, there are 16 conditions, and your staff write-up, PJ, we're in agreement with those 16 conditions. I think Brad did want to have one clarification on the one where you talked about riprap or the bulkhead along that entrance road. But with that, I will give all the rest of the time that is here to Brad Martin and to Mr. Adams, and I will stand by, and I'm done.
At this time, staff will acknowledge Mr. Martin. Mr. Martin, we are going to pull you to the mic. Would you please introduce yourself, and then we will mute you so that the chairman may swear you in.
Brad Martin. I am with Clark Design Group in Norfolk, and I'm happy to be here this morning. Thanks for all you do.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. And now, Mr. Chairman, the microphone is yours.
Mr. Martin, do you swear or affirm that the testimony you give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Mr. Martin, the microphone is now yours.
I do, so help me God.
At this time, staff will open up the microphone to Mr. Martin for his presentation on agenda item number 1. Mr. Martin, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll be brief. I don't want to repeat what's already been said. I do want to start. I would be remiss in not acknowledging what we are about to endure here is the 1-year anniversary of the tragedy. And I just want to thank PJ and all the planning staff and all the city staff for enduring a remarkable year. Your perseverance has been exceptional, and it's been great to get back to business as usual as much as we can. I want to address one of the questions from Mr. Wallace regarding the stormwater that we've shown, the 21,000 cubic feet of storage. And we've shown that in 3 different 7,000 cubic foot areas. I can guarantee you that that's not how the final design is going to work out. We have those 3 areas and then 3 vortex devices. I will tell you that that 21,000 is accurate. That's a number that falls straight out of the state code spreadsheet. We're getting numbers of 21 and 22,000 cubic feet that's going to be necessary on this project based on stormwater modeling and the final design of the layout. So we are on an order of magnitude that is correct, but based on evidence that we don't have yet, such as infiltration rates and some other very precise design elements. There may or may not be all three of those vortex devices. We may not need them, but we feel like we have put a order of magnitude concept design in front of you that is going to eventually work. So we are confident in this design. We appreciate all of the extra effort that you board members and the planning staff have put into this. So I'll be happy to stand by with any answers for any questions you may have. The issue that Mr. France brought up about those 44 spaces that are on the stub that heads out to the eastern connection on Bonnie Road. Those 44 spaces, we understand the environmental detriment of taking that wooded area out, but the closeness of those 44 spaces to our third office building are important to us. That location is important. So when you measure that entire area of those parking bays in that drive aisle, that's only 15,000 square feet. And so we feel like that's an acceptable, responsible development of that area. So we have addressed the requests that we heard in February to pull the project completely out of the 100-foot buffer. So what we end up with is only 18,000 square feet of encroachment, impervious encroachment into the buffer. And we mitigate that with 63,000 square feet of land on the seaward side of the walkway that is going to stay untouched. And then we've got another 29,000 square feet of mitigation opportunity, restoration opportunity in between the walkway and our proposed improvements. So with that, I will end my comments and stand by for questions. Thank you for all your help.
Thank you, Mr. Martin, Mr. Garrington. At this time, Mr. Chairman, staff opens the mic to any board members with comments to this agenda item. At this time, please raise your virtual hand for staff to address. Ms. Barrett McDaniels, staff acknowledges your virtual hand. June, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Martin. Brad, I'm pleased to see that you removed most of the parking or all of the parking from the buffer. I still have a question about how underground storage could possibly benefit water quality. It's certainly not in a BMP clearinghouse approved list. Are you looking at other options in order to meet 75% reduction of your pollutant load on site? I'm done.
Thank you, June. At this time, Mr. Martin, staff opens the microphone to you.
Thanks for the question, Ms. McDaniels. The storm tech system we have provided comes with what is called an isolator row. One of those rows of storage units is wrapped in silk fence. So what that does is trap pollutants there in the storage area, and it discharges cleaner water as it goes out to the outlet points. So that is actually included in the BMP stormwater clearinghouse as a manufactured treatment device. It gets, I think, 40% quality treatment of the stormwater that goes into it as long as it's sized correctly. So it does have stormwater quality treatment that is going to be accomplished in that underground storage. So, and then if we need more, we've got those vortex machines that it'll swirl through and also clean the water. So there is substantial stormwater quality shown in those storage units if we use the isolator rows that are approved by the BMP clearinghouse.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. At this time, staff will open back up the microphone to Ms. Barrett McDaniels. June, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. So Brad, you do plan to meet the water quality requirements or 75% of the water quality requirements on site?
Thank you, June. At this time, the microphone is open back up to Mr. Martin.
Within the staff write-up, let me find the page. On page 7 of the staff write-up, it does say that standard stormwater management is for sites to treat 75% on-site and 25% is allowed to go off-site in nutrient credits. Just because of the difficulty and precision sometimes of getting that. We are asking to be able to treat 25% off-site. We do expect to meet the 75% number on-site, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. At this time, staff opens the microphone back up to Ms. Barrett McDaniels. June, the microphone is yours.
That was my only question. Thank you.
Thank you, June. At this time, from the board, are there any other additional questions for either Mr. Garrington or Mr. Martin? Having not seen any additional questions, Mr. Chairman, staff opens the mic to any board members with comments to this agenda item. At this time, please raise your virtual hand for staff to address.
Mr. Smith.
Staff acknowledges the virtual hand of Mr. Smith.
I actually have a question for Brad. I guess we should ask you to tell us what a vortex device is. And also, am I correct when I see that on the north and west side of the property, you're out of the 100-foot buffer, but the green dashed line represents the variable width buffer? Those are my two questions. I'm done.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Martin, the microphone is now open to you.
A vortex device is it's a stormwater manhole, but it's an engineered stormwater manhole, which swirls the water around before it discharges. So it leaves some of the pollutants there in the bottom of the manhole. So they can be vacuumed out later. The challenge with, I shouldn't bring this up probably because I do appreciate all the positive comments, but after we've treated the stormwater in the storage facilities, we're discharging cleaner stormwater out of the storage facilities. So the vortex devices that we've shown on here, the 3 vortex devices, are not going to be very efficient because they're getting cleaner water into them. So that's why I say they may or may not be all 3 of them. There might be 1 of the 3, there might be 2 of the 3. It's going to obviously depend on the design, and we're going to meet the requirements of stormwater management. Your second question about removing our improvements out of the 100-foot buffer, but leaving them in the variable width buffer is specifically tied to how close that green buffer line gets to the corner of our property right there by the parking garage, the parking structure. We want this to be a connected development where the three office buildings feel like they're connected with each other. And to have that proposed development neck down to such a narrow area, we just didn't feel like it was going to be connected. We didn't feel like people going to office building 3 would feel good about parking in the parking structure and then walking through a little throat that was primarily just going to be a driveway. So we kept our encroachment in the variable width area of the buffer, and we feel like that's responsible. Aside from our crossing of the ditch out at the east end of the site, I don't have to tell you all that that encroachment just in the variable width buffer would have been approvable by just the staff without coming to the board. But obviously crossing the ditch brings us in front of the board. Appreciate the questions. I'm done. Over and out.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. At this time, staff will acknowledge the virtual hand of Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, the microphone is yours.
Thanks, Brad, and understood.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. At this time, staff will acknowledge the virtual hand of Miss Barrett McDaniels. June, the microphone is yours.
I'm sorry, I didn't think I had my hand up. Sorry.
That is absolutely all right. At this time, Mr. Chairman, staff does not see any further questions and asks, do any of the board members have any further questions for either staff or Mr. Garrington or Mr. Martin? Having seen none, Mr. Chairman, the mic is open to you to call for a motion.
Thank you, PJ. As I've already stated my position, I think they have worked very hard on this with city staff. I think this is a good application now. I'd like to have someone make a motion on this application.
Staff acknowledges the virtual hand raised by Mr. France as a motion. Mr. France, the microphone is now open to you.
Give me just a moment to get the proper paperwork in front of me. I move that the application of Olympia Development located at GPIN 1477524516 Bonnie Road be approved with the, how many conditions do we have, guys? You can't talk to me, so you can't help. Hold on a second, I'll get there. 16 recommended conditions as stated in the staff report.
Thank you, Mr. France. Mr. Chairman, staff opens the mic to you to call for a second.
We have a second on this motion?
Staff acknowledges the virtual hand raised by Mr. McCoy as a potential second. Mr. McCoy, the microphone is now open to you. Mr. McCoy, at this time, you may need to unmute your mic. Or mic.
He's unmuted.
And now staff opens the microphone to you.
I heard him, but nobody else did.
Mr. McCoy, I'm going to open the microphone to you one more time. We did hear your second in our earpiece, but we would like to get you on the audio for everyone to hear. So at this time, Mr. McCoy, staff opens the microphone to you.
I second the motion on Olympia Development.
Thank you, Mr. McCoy. Hearing a motion to approve the following application of Olympia Development located off of Bonnie Road with a GPIN number 1477524516 has been made. Staff will now open the vote to members of the board. If you are in favor of the motion, please say yes. If you are opposed to the motion, please say no. Please pause for 3 seconds while after your name is called for your mic to be unmuted. Ms. Barrett McDaniels.
PJ, I thought we usually had discussion after the first and second.
Thank you for your question, June. We can open the mics for discussion. Staff did not see any virtual hands. If you would like to discuss this matter, I will leave the microphone open to you, Ms. Barrett McDaniels.
Thank you. I would like to make a comment. I'm going to vote yes on this application. However, I am a little bit disappointed that a parcel that has been owned by the city of Virginia Beach can do no better than to propose parking along a greenway. I would like to see a better application. However, I do feel that they've met the requirements of the Chesapeake Bay Act. I'm pleased that they removed the parking and any impacts to the buffer area. And again, I am going to support it. I would have liked to see a better application considering the greenway. Thank you. I'm done.
At this time, thank you, June. Staff will acknowledge the virtual hand of Mr. France. Mr. France, the microphone is open to you.
Thank you, Mr. Scully. I wanted to address the couple of dissenting remarks, and I will assume from staff's progression into the first and second and voting that there are no other speakers on this item. So I'll wait for a response from that after I make my comments. So there was a comment from one of the emails that wrote in saying that we were, by approving this, somehow defiling a gem, a Central Park type of location. I think that unfortunately that writer maybe did not have an adequate picture of what this site is or was. This was formerly occupied by quite a few very intense developments, and while some of the edges of the site are naturalized, by and large, this site was covered in gravel and buildings and man-placed fill, and truly is not a Central Park gem of a site. That's just not a very fair representation of that. think that the way that the applicants have approached the site is appropriate based on the previous uses, based on the zoning, and based on the requirements that we've put into place. That concludes my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. France, for your comments. Staff will acknowledge the virtual hand of Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, PJ. I again would like to echo the comments of Mr. France regarding the dissenting comments, and also Ms. Barrett McDaniels, and the fact that I would have liked to have seen a better application. However, I believe that the applicant has met their requirements before this board. I would urge the citizens to kind of realize what we have to consider. We have to consider the application in front of us and the merits towards the no net increase of non-site off-site water pollution, and what our guidelines are, and this meets it. Unfortunately, I also want to echo the comments that this is not a pristine site. It was an intensely developed site with a hardware store, I believe, with gravel and compacted fill. And so it's not a beautiful site from that standpoint. In the center of it, the peripheral areas might be. However, I would urge the citizens that, this is something that needs to be taken up before city council and zoning boards for use. We don't control use. We control the development into the encroachment. And as long as our applicants meet that, we've got to respect that, because that's all our authority goes to. So we need to urge them to go to city council and go to zoning. And I don't know if this has gone before those two, but those are the avenues that would hear those dissenting factors. I am going to support this. I am in support of economic development. I would have liked to have seen a BMP or less parking along the Greenway, but it is what it is, and it meets our requirements, I believe, so I'm going to support it. I'm done.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. At this time, are there any additional questions or comments from members of the CBPA board? If so, please raise your virtual hand.
Mr. McCoy's hand is up.
Mr. McCoy, staff acknowledges your virtual hand. The microphone is yours.
Yeah, I'm not to be redundant, but one of the things that I find very positive in this application is, if you look at the historical aerials, this is a significant retreat from receiving waters. And aside from the fact that the majority of the site is impervious and there's been significant sedimentation over the years, just the retreat from receiving waters on impervious structures is very significant. I very much support it. Over.
Mr. France.
Thank you, Mr. McCoy. At this time, staff acknowledges the virtual hand of Mr. France. Mr. France, the microphone is yours.
If there are no dissenting remarks to hear from anybody else, I'd like to call for the question, please.
Did we make a motion?
Yeah.
Having heard a motion made by Mr. France and seconded by Mr. McCoy regarding agenda item number 1, City of Virginia Beach, property owner, Olympia Development applicant off of Bonnie Road, GPIN number 1477524516. Staff will open the vote, and staff will call on each board member individually. At this time, Ms. Barrett McDaniels, your microphone is open.
Yes.
Mr. France, your microphone is open.
Yes.
Mr. Jester, your microphone is open. Jones, your microphone is open. Mr. Jones, your microphone is open.
Yes.
Mr. McCoy, your microphone is open.
Yes.
Mr. Smith, your microphone is open.
Yes.
Mr. Steyer, your microphone is open.
Yes.
Mr. Wallace, your microphone is open.
Yes.
By a vote of 8-4, 0 against, the motion has carried. I will call the next item for the board. Agenda item number 4, application at 2916 Gaines Landing, property owner of Christopher and Yasmin Hooper, applicant of Dr. Yugal Beal. Staff will prepare the presentation in a moment. If staff's presentation would be put up on the screen. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, the application you have in front of you today is for an encroachment into the resource protection area buffer to construct an in-ground swimming pool with associated paver patio and pool house. Looking at the aerial of the site, the parcel where the proposed improvements will be situated is highlighted in yellow and is located off of Gaines Landing Road. The applicant's agent has provided an existing conditions exhibit. That exhibit was sent to you as a PDF. If you are following along in the staff report, you may also find a copy of that on page 49 of the staff report. Looking at the photos from the property, this is standing along the rear, along the side property line, looking at the rear of the parcel. In the mid-ground, you will see the existing concrete patio. That is where the proposed improvements will be situated, and they will proceed forward towards us on the property. That area in the background will be left in its natural state. Looking towards the water, this property has a relatively flat slope to the top of bank and then a very pronounced bank down to the edge of the water. When visiting the site, staff did not see any major signs of erosion occurring along the toe of the slope associated with the bank. Standing at the top of the bank, looking back into the property, you will see the existing residence. Behind the existing trees and shrubbery are where the proposed improvements will be located. Transitioning over, you will see that the rear of the yard is primarily devoted towards turf. Staff is of the opinion with the proposed improvements and associated buffer restoration, there will be a benefit to the riparian buffer along this section of the Lynn Haven River. If you take a step back and look at the overall aerial in the associated bank, this is taken from an angle where you'll see that existing patio and the location of the proposed improvements adjacent to that. With the initial submittal to construct the swimming pool and associated patio, staff did express some concern to the applicant and the applicant's agent. Following along on the staff report, you will see that we did have a concern with the overall proposed impervious cover associated with the initial variance and the amount of encroachment into the resource protection area. Staff made reference to this on page 45 of the staff report, specifically with condition 4 that required the maximum impervious cover of the parcel not to exceed 13,625 square feet. As such, prior or leading up to this public hearing today, staff did receive a revised site plan from the applicant and applicant's agent. What you have up on the screen right now is the initial submittal to staff. What has been revised is now up on your screen. Staff will toggle back and forth. You will see initially the swimming pool was further into the resource protection area. The patio extended further south on the property, and there was a proposed pool house associated with that. The revised application that was submitted to the board for y'all's deliberation today has removed the southern portion of the patio expansion, the pool house, and has also reduced the distance between the back porch and the pool, bringing the improvements closer to the residents. Again, for the board's review, this was the initial submittal that is projected up onto your screen right now. This is the revised site plan that staff received. Staff would like to point out that there is CBPA history associated with this property. That history involves the development or the subdivision of Gaines Landing. The conditions of that variance are on page 42 of the staff report, and that CBPA variance is from December 11th, 1996. In addition, staff would like to point out condition 3 of the staff report indicating the amount of buffer restoration required, as well as limits of fill and no perimeter fill being permitted, with condition number 14 on page 45 of the staff report. At this time, staff will open up comments from the board to staff. And if you would, at this time, please raise your virtual hand. Mr. Jones, staff acknowledges your virtual hand, and the microphone is now yours.
PJ, I think this is a good project. I appreciate the revision. Again, I had this on my consent based on seeing that reduction in the impervious cover. So I knew they were going to have to work that out. I'm glad they got something to you to present to us. My only question is, it says down here on the front page, on page 41, that there's proposed impervious cover in the 50-foot seaward. It looks like is that a change in cover? Are they redoing the walkway? Or what is the new cover in the 50-foot seaward? It doesn't look like I see any new development. I'm done.
Thank you, Mr. Jones, for your comment. You are correct. There is no new impervious cover proposed within the 50-foot seaward buffer. At this time, staff will acknowledge the virtual hand of Ms. Barrett McDaniels. June, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, PJ. Um, Based on the revisions to the site plan, how far is are the improvements from the top of bank now? Are they closer to meeting the 75 feet that's required on the original subdivision? I'm done.
If the board would please wait for one moment, staff is going to obtain that measurement. Ms. Barrett McDaniels, those improvements appear to be 50 feet from the top of bank. At this time, staff will acknowledge the virtual hand of Ms. Barrett McDaniels. June, the microphone is yours.
I would like to reserve the opportunity to ask of the applicant, have they spoken to both neighbors on either side to see if they have any objection? Thank you, I'm done.
Thank you, Ms. Barrett McDaniels. At this time, are there any additional questions for staff? At this time, staff will acknowledge the virtual hand of Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, the microphone is yours.
Yes, the wood patio down at the bottom of the bank, that's existing, correct? I'm done.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Yes, you are correct. There is a very steep bank along the property, and that is for access down that bank to the pier. At this time, are there any additional questions for staff? Mr. Smith, staff acknowledges your virtual hand. The microphone is yours.
I'm sorry, I forgot to take my hand down. No question.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, staff does not see any further questions, and at this time, we will call the applicant's agent, Mr. Garrington, to the microphone. Mr. Garrington has already been sworn in, so Mr. Garrington, when staff opens your mic, you may proceed. Mr. Garrington, the microphone is open to you.
Thank you, PJ. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, again for the record, Billy Garrington on behalf of the applicant. Applicant is Dr. Hugo Beal, 2916 Gaines Landing. Our disclosure statement is current. All of our fees have been paid on this project, and we again thank you for hearing this deliberation today. Mr. Jones, thank you very much for trying to put it on consent agenda. I appreciate it. And I understand that there were some concerns about that, and I will try to address those as best I can. But in the staff write-up, there are 17 conditions that were put in there as a part of the report by PJ, and I want to tell you that we're in agreement with those conditions. And I want to reiterate that we have gone back and done a significant reduction over the first submittal that we gave to you. And it was a reduction of 703 square feet of impervious cover to get us down to the number that you see that where PJ is talking about now. Also, with regard to the top of the bank on this property, there's that condition that was on the original development about staying a certain number of feet from the top of the bank. But I want you to remember that when these houses were being built, that's where we measured the top of bank from. We didn't go to the 3-foot contour or the edge of water, marsh, and wetlands. That line on this piece of property where you now measure the 100-foot buffer from is seaward of the top of bank because the 3-foot contour is seaward of that area. So that's where the rub with that condition comes in. But we are closer to the top of bank than the 75 feet that was originally required on this subdivision when it was put to record. But again, that line has changed. There is one other offer that we can make to you on this piece of property, and that is the area of the existing brick paver walkway that is in the seaward portion of the buffer would be removed and would be replaced with stepping stones in a organic material, which is what the board likes to see anytime you're in the seaward portion of the buffer. And there is some of that walkway that's in the seaward portion. So with those changes that we have offered, you're going to get significant buffer restoration on this property. You're going to get payment to Lynn Haven Oyster Heritage Fund. And since our land disturbance is over 2,500 square feet, we have to treat 100% of the rainwater that comes off this property. That's 3 pretty big investments that you're getting in return for him allowing them to build this swimming pool in the backyard. So with that, I will conclude my testimony and answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Mr. Garrington, thank you. Mr. Chairman, at this time, staff will open up any comments to the board members towards the applicant regarding this agenda item. Board members, if you would, please raise your virtual hands if you have any comments or questions for Mr. Garrington. Ms. Barrett McDaniels, staff recognizes your virtual hand. June, the microphone is open to you.
Thank you, Mr. Garrington. I did ask the question previously, has the both the adjacent neighbors, have they been contacted, and has this been discussed with them? And then secondly, could you please explain what you mean by the top of bank location changing? Are you saying that the top of bank that is shown on the subdivision plat is not the same top of bank that we're speaking about now? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Barrett McDaniels. Mr. Garrington, staff opens your microphone.
Thank you, PJ. Mrs. McDaniels, the top of the bank is still in the same place on this property that it was back in 1997. Only thing I'm saying is that in 97, you measured the first 100-foot buffer from the top of the bank. You now measure that from the edge of water, marsh, or wetlands. And that area where we start measuring that now is about 15 feet seaward of the top of the bank. Your second part of your question is the neighbors. We have contacted both the neighbors. They are aware of the request that is ongoing today, and they had no objection to the request at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Garrington. At this time, staff opens the microphone to any board members that may have any questions. At this time, Mr. Chairman, staff does not see any additional questions from the members of the board. At this time, Mr. Chairman, if there are no further questions, staff opens the mic to you to call for a motion.
I've looked at this application, and based on them following the staff guidelines, I'm going to support this. I think, and the additional give up that Mr. Carrington's offered, which I think we should accept, is a great deal of help on the seaward 50-foot buffer. And removing the pool house takes away any visual impairment that any of the neighbors would have had, and I can see where they would not object, since these houses seem to line up. So I'm going to support it and asking for somebody to make a motion. Thank you.
At this time, staff acknowledges the virtual hand of Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, the microphone is yours.
I'm going to make a motion on the applicant, Dr. Hugo Beal, at 2916 Gaines Landing to approve the encroachment into resource protection area to construct an in-ground swimming pool and associated pool patio with the 18 reasonable and appropriate conditions, with the 18th one added to be replacement of the walkway to the pier with a 50% coverage patio as offered by the applicant. Granting this variance will not confer upon the applicant any special privilege or convenience not accorded to owners of property in Chesapeake Bay Preservation Area who's subject to the provisions of this ordinance similarly situated, because the proposed improvements are in keeping with the development of the neighborhood and adjacent lots, given an aerial review of the associated with the 1996 CBPA variance shown similar improvements that the applicant is requesting with this variance application. This variance is not based on conditions or circumstances that are or have been created or imposed by the applicant, given that the existing vegetative cover along the shoreline and well-kept conditions of the existing upland improvements are in harmony with the finding of the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Area Ordinance and the CBPA Board variance granted in 1996. Variance is the minimum necessary to afford relief based on the conditions granted by the board with respect to reducing the overall impervious cover of the proposed improvements. The variance is in harmony with the purpose and intent of this ordinance and not injurious to the neighborhood, not a substantial detriment to water quality or otherwise detrimental to the public welfare, because the proposed improvements are in keeping with the development of this neighborhood and adjacent parcels. The site currently does not offer any stormwater mitigation for the bay. However, if approved, the proposed development will be required to have treatment provided between the improvements and the waterway. As a means towards no net increase in non-point source pollution load, buffer restoration and bioretention storm management will be placed between the improvements in the waterway to capture, treat runoff to the discharge to the Lynnhaven River, and the reduction in impervious cover with a 50% pervious walkway to the pier will enhance this. Given the existing topography with the rear yard and distance of the proposed improvements will be from the top of bank feature, board is of the opinion that this will require that the required buffer restoration will offer merits towards creation of a riparian ecosystem within the 100-foot RPA buffer. I am done.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Mr. Chairman, staff turns the microphone over to you for a second.
Any further discussions on this application?
Mr. Wallace, staff will acknowledge your virtual hand. The microphone is open to you.
I second the motion.
Hearing a second, a motion to approve the following application. Of Dr. Hugo Beal at 2916 Gaines Landing has been, or a motion has been made by Mr. Jones, seconded by Mr. Wallace. At this time,
Mr. France has his hand up.
staff will acknowledge the virtual hand of Mr. France. Mr. France, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Scully. I'm not going to support this application. I originally did, but upon reviewing the testimony and the previous CBPA ordinance history, it's clearly stated on this lot that it's supposed to stay 75 feet away from the top of the bank. They're actually, and if you look at the aerials, when I look at the aerials, I can see that all of the neighbors have also complied with those issues of encumbrance and have not encroached further than what was originally agreed to. I think when we start allowing for those additional encroachments, not only is it new construction in the 100-foot buffer, but it's relieving them of a self-imposed restriction that they bought into when they purchased that lot. And that's not consistent with being in compliance with what is required in the neighborhood and what the neighborhood has complied with. So I don't see how we can approve this variance as it's been presented. There's no hardship that anybody's created other than one that they've put on themselves.
Thank you, Mr. France.
Mr. Jones's hand up, but it's stayed
At this time,
up. Mr. Steyer.
staff will acknowledge the virtual hand of Mr. Steyer. Mr. Steyer, the microphone is yours.
Hey, Dave, I just wanted to point out, at least based on the records I see, that the ownership of this property may have changed hands about a month ago in April. So I don't know if that affects any of your thoughts or current line of thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Steyer. Yes, staff does acknowledge that when this application first came in prior to the coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic, the property owner was Christopher and Yasmin Hooper, and the applicant was Dr. Yugal Beal. At that time, believe it was contingent upon a CBPA application. When the staff reports got published for the virtual hearing, staff did check in the records to see if that transfer had occurred. We are usually a little bit delayed, but we have kept it as how it was advertised. Thank you. Staff acknowledges the virtual hand of Ms. Barrett McDaniels. June, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, PJ. I have the same concern that I don't particularly like undoing the previous board action, especially when it concerns the original subdivision requirements of the 75-foot setback from the top of the bank. Very familiar with this property and the adjacent properties, and I know how steep the bank is along the river. So I believe that setback was there for a reason. It travels with the with the plat of the property itself, so nobody's surprised by any conditions placed on it. So I do not support it at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Barrett McDaniels. At this time, staff acknowledges the virtual hand of Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, the microphone is yours.
Yeah, PJ, just for clarification, you said you left the staff report as it was initially submitted, but are we saying that the property did exchange hands, or is our understanding that the property is still under contract contingent on this board's approval? I'm not sure that that has any bearing on how I would view the application, but it may for someone.
At this time, staff is going off of Mr. Steyer's comment that the property has transitioned over to the applicant. At the time that the staff report was published, city records did still indicate that it was the property ownership as Christopher and Yasmin Hooper. With any CBPA variance, the variance does run with the land. So with the property changing ownership, if the board votes to approve or deny the application, that record would be associated with 2916 Gaines Landing. Thank you. At this time, staff recognizes the virtual hand of Mr. France. Mr. France, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Scully. I wanted to respond back to Mr. Steyer's comment about the property changing hands and whether or not that influenced my decision making. I think that that influences it, unfortunately, in the negative way, because that means that both the seller and the buyer were well aware that there is an existing encumbrance on the land, and they're trying to get a variance from that encumbrance. So in my mind, this is a eyes wide open situation. They've requested that we give them a variance, and I don't see any evidence that we should support it. That concludes my comments.
Thank you, Mr. France. At this time, staff acknowledges the virtual hand of Mr. Wallace. Mr. Wallace, the microphone is yours.
Yes, I hear the comments, and plus I heard the chairman's comment that the TOB is not significant in this case. So it caused a little confusion on my part, but I'm one that supports previous rules and regulations until the board sees fit that to change them. But when you change things like that, you bring a little bit of discomfort in the community. So I just want to say that based on what the chairman has told me about TOB, I'll be supporting this. So hopefully that doesn't upset anybody. Thank you. Done.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace. At this time, staff acknowledges the virtual hand of Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm a little torn on this one because I understand that we have a previous board opinion, and that carries a lot of weight. But at the same time, I believe there is no stormwater treatment at this time on this property. Is that correct?
Thank you, Mr. Smith. To staff's knowledge, at this time, there is no known stormwater BMPs. If you would follow along in the staff report on page 48, you will see that the December 11th, 1996 CBPA board variance exhibit was for the creation of the subdivision, and no improvements were associated with that subdivision. So they were basically, not to say they were working off of a building envelope, but they were working off of the conditions of that variance when constructing individual homes. Thank you. At this time, staff will open the mic back to Mr. Smith.
Yeah, I think I'm going to support this application. It's a tough one for me, but at the end of the day, there's no treatment there now. There will be. Most of the improvements appear to be on flat ground, as would all the land disturbance. So short of any revelations after my speaking here, I'm going to support the application. Thank you. Done.
At this time, the board recognizes the hand of the chairman. Mr. Chairman, the microphone is yours.
So Dave France has just about turned me, but not quite. Having, in a neighborhood that I live in, pools become something that the city has to deal with, and it's something that people want. That condition, it's flat construction. They took away any of the structure on this. I'm not sure the reasoning for the top of bank as a condition, but it doesn't mean that decisions made 24 years ago were perfect, just like we've dealt with the requirement to have riprap, which took away half the yard and offered no chance for any improvement of water quality. So based on the fact that staff has said they're fine with it, the applicants come back and worked with staff. They've offered up a couple other things on the 50-foot seaward. It's not something I'm real warm and fuzzy about, but I don't have enough to make me say that this is not a reasonable request. So I'm still going to support it, but I certainly get your message, Mr. France and Mrs. Barrett. And I think Mr. Garrington represents a lot of people. So, Mr. Garrington, it's loud and clear. This is not a hall pass right here. I don't know if he's even going to pass today. So, just letting you know. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, staff acknowledges the virtual hand of Mr. France. Mr. France, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Scully. Two points that have come out there. One, with respect to stormwater management, the subdivision would have had to have had some sort of stormwater management in 1996. I couldn't speak to what it was, but it certainly was a requirement that we provide stormwater management for development projects in 1996. So there would have been something in place, and we don't know without getting into the math whether or not us giving relief to encroach further towards the water would undo those existing stormwater management benefits. So to say that this site or this lot doesn't have any stormwater management already maybe sort of accurate in that it might not live on the site itself, it might not be on the parcel, but the subdivision itself would have had to have had an approach for stormwater management that would have been employed. The second thing that I think is we haven't discussed, and I don't really understand how it is that even legally what we do matters or doesn't matter, because item number 6 in the CBPA ordinance variance history on page 42 establishes that these requirements, including the 75-foot setback, are deed restrictions that are supposed to run with the subdivision plat and with the land. So we're making a decision here that runs against a self-imposed deed restricted constraint on the property. And I'm not even sure that us taking that action relieves them or allows them to do what they want to do. So again, it goes back to me to the eyes wide open issue of this is not one of those ones where somebody didn't know that there was a Ches Bay or didn't know there was an ordinance. I mean, they were actively in the process of making an application to go against something that was a deed restricted constraint on their property. And it just doesn't make sense to me that we would give them relief from that when none of the rest of the neighborhood has that relief. In fact, they all have the same deed restriction. That concludes my comments.
Thank you, Mr. France for your comments. At this time, staff will acknowledge the hand of the chairman. Mr. Chairman, the microphone is open.
Dave France, you made me think here again, and I totally get the deed restriction. I've been down the road on that several times before at the north end, and you've changed my mind. I'm not going to support this application. Thank you.
Staff acknowledges the virtual hand of Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, the microphone is yours.
Can we get an opinion from the city attorney that's with us on this deed restriction? Because I do know there have been several applications on this street, and Mr. France, brought up the aerial photos, but if you look at 2/3 of these properties, and this is a very fluctuating shoreline, 2/3 of these properties have pools. And some of them have pools that are close, some of them don't. Some of them have properties that are closer to the top of bank and the feature than this house, specifically being the new house at the end of the street on the point. And so I would say this does, I fully understand and I can relate to the chairman and the vice chairman's concerns with this one. But I would like an answer on the deed restriction question. Can we even do this? And maybe this is something that needs to go before zoning or something before it's being heard from us. I'm still in support of it because I think it keeps in harmony with the neighborhood. I know this lot very, very well because I've spent a lot of time in the water right in front of it. And it's a very stable shoreline with marsh, and then it's got a pretty steep bank that's well established, and then it's flat ground way up, way beyond where these improvements are going to be. It's not really encroaching on anything that would give me pause on water quality. If anything, what they're doing in the new buffer we're getting, and BMP requirements to put in a pool to treat anything would actually bring me less concern on this property because of the size of the dwelling already. But I do think it keeps in harmony. I would like to support it, but I want to know from the city attorney whether this is something we can even hear and rule on to where it's going to be a factor, or is this still going to have to go before zoning to occur?
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Smith. At this time, staff is going to open up the microphone of the city attorney. Tori, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, BJ. Hi. So this deed restriction would be a private matter. We don't really interpret this for the property owner, but I think PJ has further clarification on how the board is supposed to handle a situation like this.
Thank you, Tori. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, if you can just give me one moment here, I need to flip through a document. Okay, thank you for your time. There is a section on page 11 of the deed, section 9, under resource protection area, Says no owner shall engage in or cause any land disturbance of any areas of any lot designated as a resource protection area as that term is defined by the Chesapeake Bay Act, except as expressly permitted herein without first obtaining permission of the declarant and without applying for and obtaining a Chesapeake Bay Preservation Area Act variance from the City of Virginia Beach Chesapeake Bay Preservation Area Board. With that, staff opens the mic back up to Mr. France. Mr. France, the microphone is yours.
Here, I didn't even have my hand up. Okay, so if I heard what you just said, let me see if I can restate it. That the deed restriction that was imposed at that time said you're hereby deed restricted unless you go back to the board and get a variance.
To staff's knowledge, that is correct. At this time, staff opens or acknowledges the virtual hand of Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. So in light of that, I guess my take is that they are proceeding as their deed restrictions suggest, and not certain that was the intent of the original board, that exception would be included in the deed restriction, but regardless, it's there. So my support of the application as of now is still unwavering.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. At this time, staff acknowledges the virtual hand of Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, the microphone is yours.
In light of reading that deed restriction, I'm unwavering in my support of this. I think it keeps in harmony with the neighborhood. I think they've spent the money, gone through everything, met all the staff's recommendations, and are just basically doing what 2/3 of this neighborhood's allowed to do. And they're spending the money and going through it the way they're supposed to. And this is a lot that can well support that and needs the buffer restoration. Even if they didn't have a pool, it could use the buffer restoration. And it is not a sensitive lot from a standpoint of where these improvements are going. I'm unwavering in my support. I'm not going to withdraw my my motion to approve. Thank you. I'm done.
At this time, are there any other additional questions for staff or the applicant's agent? Mr. Chairman, staff does not see any additional questions from the board. A motion to approve the following application. Hold on one second here. Agenda item number 4, property located at 2916 Gaines Landing Road for the applicant of Dr. Ugal Beal. Has been made by Mr. Jones and seconded by Mr. Wallace. The vote will be open, and staff will call upon each board member individually. If you are in favor of the motion, please say yes. If you are opposed, please say no. Please pause for 3 seconds following your name being called so that your mic may be unmuted. At this time, staff calls Miss Barrett McDaniels. June, your mic is now open.
No.
Mr. France, your mic is now open.
No.
Mr. Jester, your mic is now open.
No.
Mr. Jones, your mic is now open.
Yes.
Mr. McCoy, your mic is now open.
Yes.
Mr. Smith, your mic is now open.
Yes.
Mr. Steyer, your mic is now open.
Yes.
Mr. Wallace, your mic is now open.
Yes.
By a vote of 5 for, 3 against, the motion has carried. Mr. Chairman, at this time, there are no more agenda items for today's public hearing. I pass the mic back to you.
So if there's no other business to come before the board today, if there is, please raise your hand, your virtual hand at this time. Seeing none, thank you to the public and to the board members for participating in today's virtual meeting. The recording of this special public hearing will be posted on the board's website at bbgov.com/cbpa within 10 days. The meeting is adjourned.